It was Christmas Eve, and everything seemed normal. The house was decorated with all the usual trimmings, tinsel hanging from the walls, candles flickering on the mantel, and the scent of gingerbread and cinnamon lingering in the air. The Christmas tree stood proudly in the corner of the living room, adorned with twinkling lights and sparkling ornaments. My family was busy preparing for the night ahead. My mother was in the kitchen. My younger sister was running around in excitement, and the sounds of holiday music filled the background. There was a peculiar stillness that came with the night, the sort of quiet that only Christmas Eve seemed to carry. Everything was in place, just like every other year, and yet something felt out of place. It wasn't an obvious difference, but there was a weight to the silence, something that seemed to linger in the corners of the room. After dinner, we gathered in the living room to open presents. The fire crackled in the fireplace as we settled in, unwrapping gifts, laughing and chatting. But there, just on the edge of the pile of presents, was a gift that stood out. It was a small, plain box, wrapped in bright red paper, tied with a silver bow. It was different from the others. There was no name tag on it, no indication of who it was for. I glanced at my parents, but neither of them had placed it there. The gift was a mystery. It had not been there when we first started the evening. No one had mentioned it. It wasn't from a neighbor or a distant relative. It simply appeared, unannounced and unexplained. "Who put this here?" I asked, pointing to the box. My mom looked over, scanning the room. "Not me," she replied. "Did you bring it?" "I thought you did," my father said, looking just as puzzled. I bent down and gently picked it up. The paper was unusually cold, more so than any other gift. It felt as though it had been sitting outside in the snow. I placed it back under the tree, but it stayed in my thoughts as the evening went on. No one seemed to give it a second glance, but I could not shake the feeling that it didn't belong. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, the house was quiet. The only sounds were the soft ticking of the clock in the hallway and the faint crackle of the fire that was slowly dying out. I was awake, restless. The house was still, but it wasn't the calm quiet I'd grown used to on Christmas Eve. It was unnerving. The thought of the box crept into my mind again. Something about it didn't sit right. Slowly, I got out of bed, careful not to disturb anyone. I crept downstairs, moving quietly through the darkened hallways. The dim glow of the Christmas tree lights cast long shadows on the walls, making the house feel larger than it was. When I entered the living room, the box was still there, sitting under the tree. It had not been moved. I bent down and touched it again. The paper was as cold as it had been earlier, almost unnatural. I carefully lifted the box. There was no sound, no rattle, no movement. It felt as though it was empty, but why would anyone wrap an empty box? I walked over to the kitchen drawer and pulled out a small knife. It was a delicate tool, perfect for cutting wrapping paper, though it felt heavy in my hand. I moved back to the box and cut through the red paper carefully, exposing the cardboard beneath. Inside was another box, simple and unadorned. It seemed to have been well used, with worn edges and discoloration that suggested it had been sitting in storage for a long time. I lifted the lid. Inside, there was a small wooden toy. It was a rocking horse, no more than a few inches tall. The wood was pale, almost bleached white, as if it had been left in the sun for too long. The edges of the toy were smooth, but the surface had a dull sheen to it, as if it had been handled frequently over the years. The paint on the saddle and reins was chipped, worn away in places, and the face, its tiny black eyes were dull and lifeless, staring out from the horse's head. What was more disturbing than the toy itself, however, was the crack that ran along the side of the horse. It was shaped like a smile, a twisted, faint grin that seemed to be carved into the wood, as though someone had deliberately shaped it that way. It wasn't random, it felt purposeful. The atmosphere in the room seemed to shift as I stared at the toy. The air felt colder, though the fire still burned faintly in the next room. I didn't want to touch the toy again, but I couldn't help myself. I reached for it. As soon as my fingers made contact, a faint sound echoed through the room. It was a soft, slow creaking sound, like the rocking horse was already moving. I quickly pulled my hand back, and the sound stopped. The room was still again. I tried to dismiss it. Perhaps it was just my imagination, or perhaps the sound had come from somewhere else in the house. I placed the toy back into the box, closed the lid, and stood up, but the creaking came again. It was faint, but it was unmistakable. The sound came from the far corner of the room, just beyond the Christmas tree. It was a rhythmic tapping, like someone tapping their fingers on the floor. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the room. The shadows cast by the tree seemed to move, stretching and shifting as if they were alive. And then, There it was. The rocking horse was no longer in the box. It was sitting in the far corner of the room, rocking slowly back and forth on its own, as if someone had placed it there. The toy was eerily still, except for the gentle rocking motion, which seemed to grow slower and more deliberate with each movement. The tapping sound continued, almost in time with the rocking. I stared at the toy. It was exactly where it had not been just moments ago. There was no explanation for how it had moved. There had been no sound, no footsteps. The house was completely still. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. The shadows grew deeper, and I felt as though the room had become more expansive, stretching beyond what I knew it to be. I stepped forward cautiously. The toy stopped rocking. The tapping ceased. I reached out and grabbed the toy, not wanting to leave it where it was. The moment my fingers touched it, I heard the distinct sound of wood cracking. It was as if the toy itself was reacting, like it was trying to resist being touched. I quickly placed the rocking horse back into the box and hurried to the front door. I didn't want to look back. I grabbed the box, rushed outside, and threw it into the trash can in the yard. The lid slammed shut as though the box was being sealed away for good. Back inside, I locked all the doors and windows, double-checked the locks, and made sure the house was secure. The strange feeling lingered. The house didn't feel like my own anymore. The shadows in the corners of the rooms seemed to shift when I wasn't looking, and I could hear faint sounds echoing from somewhere deep within the house. I stayed up the rest of the night, watching the clock slowly tick away the hours. Every now and then, I would glance at the tree, half expecting to see that toy once more, but it was gone. It had to be gone. The box was in the trash. The next morning, I went outside to check. The trash had been emptied. The can was empty, but there was no sign of the box, no trace of the toy. It was as if it had never been there at all. I never spoke of it to anyone. It seemed too bizarre, too unbelievable. Perhaps it had been a trick of the mind, a bad dream in the midst of the holiday season. But I couldn't shake the sense that something had followed me back into the house. It lingered, hidden in the corners, waiting. Every Christmas since then, I hear the faint tapping, even in the quietest moments. And each year, I make sure there's nothing under the tree. No more mysterious gifts, because I know one thing for sure. It's still out there, somewhere, and I will never be able to escape it. It was the winter of 2012, and the small town of Brooksville was already blanketed in snow. It had been one of the coldest winters in memory, with heavy snowfall that started in early December and hadn't let up since. By Christmas Eve, the entire town seemed to have disappeared beneath layers of white. The streets were quiet, save for the occasional crunch of footsteps in the snow or the faint hum of a passing car. Christmas lights twinkled from every window, and wreaths hung proudly on every door. But despite the festive decorations, there was a feeling of isolation that gripped the town. I had just moved into a modest house on Elm Street with my wife, Lisa, and our young daughter, Clara. It wasn't the first time we'd lived in a small town, but it was the first time we'd been in a neighborhood like this one. Our house was at the very end of the block, nestled against the edge of the woods. The people who lived there had lived there for decades, or so it seemed, and it didn't take long for us to realize that we were the new faces in the neighborhood. The older residents were polite but distant, and the younger ones were too busy with their own lives to offer much of a welcome. It wasn't unfriendly, but it wasn't exactly warm either. As Christmas approached, we were excited to experience a real winter holiday. We decorated the house with lights, hung stockings by the fireplace, and baked cookies with Clara, just like we always did when I was a kid. It was going to be the perfect holiday, I thought. The kind of cozy, small-town Christmas you see in movies. But there was one thing that bothered me: the house next door. It wasn't that the house itself was unusual. It was just like the others. An old two-story home with ivy growing up the side and a couple of trees in the yard. But it had been empty for weeks. No sign of anyone moving in or out. The blinds were always drawn, and I never saw anyone come or go. The yard had a few patches of dead grass, but the snow always seemed to settle around it, untouched, almost like no one had been there in years. I'd occasionally see strange figures behind the windows at night, shadows that moved, but no lights ever flickered on. It made me uneasy, but I didn't think much of it. I assumed the house was just another one of those abandoned properties, left to deteriorate over time. Christmas Eve arrived, and we were just finishing dinner. Clara was excited about the presents under the tree, and Lisa was putting the final touches on the Christmas stockings. I was sitting in the living room, watching the flickering light from the fireplace dance across the walls, when I heard a faint knock at the door. It was odd. The knock was light, almost timid, and I couldn't think of anyone who would be visiting us on Christmas Eve. The neighbors rarely stopped by, and we hadn't received any invitations to holiday parties. I opened the door, half expecting to find some kind of Christmas caroler or a stray delivery. Instead, there was nothing but the cold, dark night and a small, plain package on the doorstep. The package was wrapped in brown paper, tied with a thin piece of twine, and there was no return address, just my name written in neat, careful handwriting on the front. I picked it up and glanced around the yard. The street was eerily quiet, save for the distant hum of a car passing by. There was no one in sight. It struck me as strange, but not enough to make me feel alarmed. Maybe a neighbor had left it for us as a Christmas gift. I figured it was probably a mistake. Maybe they had the wrong house, but there was no sign of anyone, and I couldn't help but feel like the package had been waiting for me. I brought it inside and set it on the table, telling Lisa about it. She thought it was strange too, but shrugged it off. "It's probably from one of the neighbors. You should open it." I hesitated for a moment. Something about the package didn't sit right with me. It wasn't the wrapping or the twine. It was the weight of it. It felt wrong, too light for its size, as if there was nothing inside but air. I tore off the paper and opened the cardboard box. Inside, it was simple, carved wood with delicate brass hinges, the kind of thing you might find in an antique store. It was beautiful in a way, but there was something unsettling about it. The design on the front was unfamiliar, just swirls and shapes that seemed random. But when I stared at it too long, I felt a strange dizziness. I lifted the music box, and before I could even think to wind it, the lid slowly creaked open. A soft, haunting tune began to play. "That's strange," Lisa said, eyeing the box. She was trying to be polite, but the music made her uneasy too. "Who would leave us something like this?" The tune played on, slow and mournful, filling the room with an eerie atmosphere. Clara, who had been playing with her toys in the living room, suddenly stopped and stared at the music box. Her face grew pale, and she backed away slowly, her little hands gripping her stuffed animal tightly. "Mummy," she whispered. "Who gave you that?" "Don't be silly," I said, trying to reassure her. "It's just a gift, honey. Someone left it for us." But Clara didn't move. She was still staring at the box, her eyes wide with fear. "Who gave it to you?" she repeated, this time with more urgency in her voice. Before I could answer, the doorbell rang. I went to the door, slightly startled, but when I opened it, there was no one there, just the cold, silent street. The wind had picked up, and snowflakes swirled in the air. I closed the door quickly, glancing once more at the empty yard next door, the house where no one had been seen for weeks. I walked back to the living room, but when I turned the corner, my heart dropped into my stomach. The music box was gone. It wasn't on the table anymore. It wasn't on the shelf. It was as if it had vanished into thin air. Lisa looked at me in confusion. "Where's the box?" I don't know," I said, my voice trailing off. I felt a chill spread through my body, but I dismissed it as just nerves. It had to be somewhere. Maybe I had moved it and forgotten. Maybe Clara had picked it up, but she swore she hadn't touched it. But then Clara said something that made my blood run cold. "Mummy, it's in the window." I turned slowly, almost afraid to look, but there it was, sitting on the windowsill in the living room, the same music box, and the same haunting tune playing. It hadn't been there a moment ago. I would have seen it, but there it was, as if it had appeared from nowhere. I rushed to the window, pulled the curtain back, and looked out into the night, and that's when I saw it. The figure standing in the dark yard next door, staring directly at me. His face was obscured by the shadows, but I could tell he was tall. Too tall. His figure seemed almost unnatural, as if he didn't belong in the frame of the window. And then, just like that, he was gone. Disappeared, vanished. The music box stopped playing. We didn't sleep that night. Every time I tried to close my eyes, I felt like someone was watching me. Lisa couldn't stop looking out the window, and Clara stayed in her room with the door locked, clutching her stuffed animal. The next morning, the box was gone. It wasn't on the windowsill. It wasn't anywhere in the house. We searched everywhere, but the strange feeling lingered. The house next door was still empty, and every Christmas since, when the snow falls heavy and the night feels too still, I sometimes think I can hear the faint sound of music in the wind. It was the Christmas season, and everything seemed to be falling perfectly into place. The weather had turned cold and the streets were lined with snow, turning the town into a winter wonderland. Christmas lights sparkled from every window, and wreaths adorned front doors. The smell of pine trees, baked goods, and wood smoke filled the air. For me, Christmas was always a time for family. My parents, my younger brother and I would spend the holiday together, just like we had every year. My mom would cook a huge Christmas dinner. We'd all gather in the living room around the tree to exchange gifts. And afterward, we'd spend the evening watching Christmas movies, laughing, and enjoying each other's company. Nothing unusual ever happened during these nights. It was always just the simple joy of being together. But that year, something changed. It started on Christmas Eve. The day had been typical enough. Shopping, cooking, and preparing everything for the big day. My mum was busy in the kitchen, and my dad was tinkering with the Christmas lights that had mysteriously stopped working, while my brother was out with friends. I was finishing up a last-minute project for work in the quiet of my bedroom. It was already dark outside by the time everything was ready for the night, the kind of winter night where the darkness seems to settle early. The only sounds were the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the old wall clock, and the occasional laughter drifting from the living room. I decided to take a walk outside to stretch my legs and clear my head. I bundled up in a heavy coat, gloves, and scarf. Stepping out into the cold, crisp air, the streets were eerily quiet. Most of the neighbors had already gone inside for the night, their homes glowing warmly through the windows, their Christmas lights casting soft reflections on the snow. The snow crunched beneath my boots as I walked, and for a moment, it felt like the world had stopped, like I was the only one awake in the quiet town. As I walked down the block, I noticed a man standing on the corner near the end of our street. He was dressed in a long, dark coat, his back to me. I didn't think much of it at first. People were always out walking in the evening, especially around Christmas time, but something about him seemed odd. There was no one else around, and it struck me as strange that he was standing there, perfectly still, as if waiting for something. I continued walking, planning to pass him by, but as I got closer, I felt a strange unease creep over me. He hadn't moved. He didn't seem to acknowledge my presence at all. His posture was stiff, like he was frozen in place, just standing there, staring out into the street. I quickly walked past, trying to avoid eye contact, but as I did, I heard the sound of his footsteps behind me. I glanced over my shoulder, and to my surprise, he was walking now, not far behind, but not quite close enough to be threatening. It was as though he had started walking the moment I did. I couldn't explain why, but the fact that he was following me without saying a word made my skin crawl. I increased my pace, hoping he would just go away, but the footsteps continued, always a few steps behind me. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I tried to figure out what was going on. Who was this man? Why was he following me? I didn't want to look back again, but I felt compelled to. I stole a quick glance over my shoulder. He was still there, walking in the same slow, deliberate pace. His face was hidden beneath the brim of his hat, but there was something unsettling about his movements. Something about him just felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it. It was the way he moved, like he wasn't quite walking, but gliding, almost unnaturally smooth. I turned down the next street, hoping to lose him, but the footsteps followed. I could feel them now, getting closer. They weren't fast, but they were deliberate. I sped up, my heart beginning to pound, but I didn't want to break into a full run. I wasn't sure why, but I felt like if I ran, it might make things worse. When I turned the corner onto my street, I glanced up at my house. It was only a few houses away now, but I still didn't feel safe. There was something about the whole situation that didn't sit right. I reached for my phone in my pocket, planning to call my mom, but before I could even unlock the screen, I heard the man's voice. "Excuse me." I froze. His voice was deep, quiet, almost too soft to hear over the sound of the wind, but it was unmistakable. My blood ran cold. Why was he speaking to me now? He hadn't said a word before. What did he want? I didn't answer. I couldn't. I kept walking toward my house, but my mind raced with questions. Who was this man? What did he want from me? Why was he following me? As I approached my front door, I felt a rush of relief. I was close to safety, but just as I was about to turn the doorknob, I heard him again, this time much closer. "Please, I just need your help." The words stopped me cold. I turned slowly, looking over my shoulder. The man was standing at the end of my driveway now, just beyond the sidewalk. He hadn't moved any closer, but the way he was looking at me was different now. There was an urgency in his eyes, but also something distant, almost hollow. I don't know who you are," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Please, leave me alone." The man's expression didn't change. He stood there, motionless, for a long moment. The silence between us felt thick, like it was pressing down on me. "Please, just a moment," he said again, taking a small step forward. "It's very important." I stepped back quickly, now fully aware of how much danger I might be in. My eyes darted to the front door behind me, then back to the stranger. He hadn't moved any closer, but I didn't trust him. "I'm calling the police," I said, reaching for my phone again. My hand was shaking as I tried to dial, but before I could press the buttons, the man's voice interrupted me once more. "Don't you remember me?" he asked softly. I stopped. The words hit me like a jolt of electricity. For a split second, my mind flashed back to a time years ago, when I was much younger. There had been a man at the grocery store one Christmas, someone who had asked my mom for help, who had seemed odd at the time. She had given him some spare change and quickly ushered us out of the store. But this man didn't look like him. He couldn't be. I stared at him, trying to see past the shadows of his face. Was he the same man? No, he was taller now. The lines on his face were deeper, and his hair was graying. But there was something familiar about the way he spoke, the way his eyes locked onto mine. The moment stretched on, and my hand was still on the door handle. I had no idea what to do. Everything in my body told me to run, but I couldn't. There was something in his voice, something in the way he spoke, that kept me frozen in place. Before I could react further, my brother came running out the front door. "What's going on?" he asked, looking back at me with a puzzled expression. The stranger turned, looking down at my brother, his face suddenly changing. His eyes shifted in a way that made me feel like he had just remembered something important. His posture stiffened, and he began to back away, his footsteps now retreating in the direction of the street. "I'm sorry," he muttered, his voice almost inaudible. "I must have the wrong house." And then, without another word, he turned and walked quickly down the sidewalk, disappearing into the night. My brother and I stood there, silent for a moment, before I quickly locked the door behind me. We didn't speak about what had happened. My brother didn't ask who the man was, and I didn't tell him. It was better that way. Later that night, as we sat in the living room, my mom and dad finally joined us, and the usual Christmas cheer returned. But the incident haunted me. I couldn't stop thinking about the man and the strange way he had spoken to me. He hadn't looked dangerous, but there was something about him that was off, something I couldn't explain. The next morning, as I made my way to the kitchen for breakfast, I saw something lying on the floor near the door. It was a small gift, wrapped simply with a handwritten note. It read, "I hope this Christmas brings you everything you need." There was no name, no return address, nothing to suggest who had left it. I never spoke to the stranger again, and to this day, I still don't know who he was or what he wanted. But every year, as Christmas approaches, I can't help but remember that night and wonder if he's still out there,